The silver blade of the moon was choked out by bruised, suffocating clouds, but the metallic tang of fresh blood was a scent Ellen Ripleyborn could never mistake. It hung heavy in the humid night air, mixing with the scent of wet pine and ozone. Ellen pressed her back against the rough bark of a cedar tree, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a wolfless omega, a defect, a human-shaped ghost in a world of apex predators, and being out past the boundary of the Crescent Moon Pack's territory was a death sentence. But tonight the forest didn't feel like a hunting ground. It felt like a graveyard. Hello to all of you incredible souls joining us today. It is truly a pleasure to have you here in this space where stories come alive. Before we dive deeper into the shadows of this forest, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. I love seeing how far our community reaches. And how are you doing today? Truly, I hope you're finding a bit of magic in your day. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and I wouldn't want you to miss a single second of the journey ahead. Ellen's fingers, calloused from years of gathering herbs and scrubbing floors the alphas deemed beneath them, trembled as she pushed aside a heavy curtain of weeping willow branches. She expected a rogue. She expected a scavenger. She did not expect the sheer, suffocating weight of the power radiating from the clearing, even in its shattered state. There, sprawled across a bed of crushed ferns, was a wolf the size of a small horse. His fur was the color of a winter storm, shadowy grays and piercing silvers, but it was currently matted with thick obsidian gore. A jagged tear ran down his flank, deep enough to expose the glimmer of bone. But it wasn't the wound that stopped Ellen's breath. It was what lay beneath him. Tucked into the curve of his massive protective belly were two tiny heaps of fluff, twin pups, no more than a few weeks old, their whimpers muffled by the alpha's dying heat. The massive wolf's eyes, a piercing molten gold even in his weakened state, snapped open. A low, subterranean growl vibrated through the earth, a sound that should have sent Ellen running for her life. He was guarding them with his final breaths, a king refusing to fall until his bloodline was safe. Ellen should have turned away. As an omega with no wolf of her own, she had no protection, no status, and no hope if a predator decided she was a snack. But as she looked into those golden eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a father. She saw someone who, like her, had been pushed to the very edge of existence. "I'm not going to hurt them," she whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped into the moonlight, showing her empty, trembling hands. "I can help you. Please. If you die, they die too." The wolf's head surged up, a terrifying display of lingering lethality, before his strength finally buckled. His head hit the dirt with a dull thud, the golden light in his eyes flickering like a dying candle. Who was this massive creature, and why were there no other guards in sight? Why were the heirs of a clearly powerful lineage left to rot in a nameless forest? Ellen knelt in the blood-soaked grass, realizing that by touching this wolf she wasn't just saving a life, she was stepping into a war that had already claimed a kingdom. The question wasn't just whether she could save him, but whether she would survive the secrets he was carrying. The weight of the massive silver wolf's head on the forest floor felt like the shifting of tectonic plates in Ellen's world. She was Ellen Ripleyborn, a woman whose very existence was considered a clerical error by the Crescent Moon Pack. In a society where the shift, the glorious, bone-cracking transformation into a wolf, was the only metric of worth, Ellen was a zero. She was 24 years old and had never felt the itch of fur beneath her skin or the song of the pack link in her mind. To her alpha she was a servant, to the local youths she was a target for cruel jests, but to herself she was a survivor. She lived in a dilapidated cabin on the extreme fringe of the territory, a place where the wood rotted and the wind howled through the gaps in the floorboards. It was a lonely life, but Ellen found a strange, quiet peace in the dirt and the roots. She knew the language of the forest better than any high-ranking sentinel. She knew which moss pulled the fever from a wound and which bark could dull the sharpest pain. This knowledge was her only weapon, her only companion. "Easy, big guy," Ellen murmured, her voice a soft thread of silk in the oppressive darkness. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the matted silver fur. Her deepest fear, the one that kept her awake during the frost-bitten winter nights, was being completely alone when the end came. Seeing this magnificent dying creature fighting to stay conscious for the sake of the two shivering pups struck a chord of empathy so deep it physically ached. She knew what it was like to have no one to turn to. She knew the terror of being the only thing standing between life and a cold, indifferent void. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Ellen began to work. She couldn't move the massive wolf. He likely weighed 4 times what she did, but she could secure the area. She gathered the twin pups first. They were tiny, smelling of milk and copper, their fur soft as dandelion down. One was a smoky black, the other a pale cream. They let out high-pitched, warbling yips as she tucked them into the thick wool-lined basket she usually used for foraging. "Stay quiet, little ones," she whispered. "The shadows have ears tonight." He turned back to the wolf. Up close, the sheer scale of him was terrifying. This wasn't a standard pack member. Even in the Crescent Moon pack, the largest enforcers didn't reach this size. His muzzle was scarred, a map of past victories, and his paws were broad enough to crush her skull with a single swipe. But as she began to clean the gaping wound on his flank with water from her canteen, he didn't snap. He didn't snarl. He simply watched her with those molten gold eyes, a heavy, intelligent gaze that seemed to strip away her defenses. As she worked, she thought of her only friend, if you could call him that, Clarice Starling Cullen, a low-ranking scout who occasionally traded extra rations for Ellen's medicinal salves. Clarice had warned her only days ago, "The winds are changing, Ellen. There are whispers of a coup in the north, of a king who vanished into the mist. Stay inside. The world is getting hungry." Ellen had dismissed it as political drama that didn't concern a wolfless girl. But now, looking at the regal curve of this wolf's brow and the undeniable aura of command that even blood loss couldn't dim, she felt a cold shiver of realization. This wasn't a rogue. This was the storm Clarice had warned her about. "Who are you?" she breathed, pressing a thick poultice of yarrow and golden seal against his side. The wolf let out a pained, huffing breath, his nose twitching as he caught her scent. Not the scent of a wolf, but something clean like rain on stone and wild lavender. He leaned his heavy head into her hand for a fleeting second, a gesture of profound, desperate trust that nearly brought Ellen to tears. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire world flipped. The most powerful predator in the woods was at the mercy of the woman the world had discarded. She stayed with him until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy. She had stitched what she could with a bone needle and silk thread, her hands steady despite the adrenaline-fueled exhaustion. She had fed the pups goat's milk she carried in a small thermos, watching as they huddled together in the basket, finally warm. But as the sun rose, the danger intensified. The scent of blood would bring scavengers, or worse, the people who had done this to him. Ellen looked from the wolf to her distant cabin. She had no way to carry him and she couldn't leave him. "I'm going to get a sled," she told him, leaning in close so her breath warmed his tattered ear. "I'm coming back for you. Do you hear me? You are not dying in the dirt today. Not on my watch." The wolf's tail gave a singular, weak thump against the ground. It was a promise. As Ellen sprinted back toward her cabin, her lungs burning, she didn't realize that she was being watched. High in the branches of a nearby ancient oak, a pair of eyes, not golden but a cold, malicious red, followed her every move. The hunt for the king had not ended in the clearing. It had only just begun, and Ellen had just placed herself directly in the crosshairs of a god. The sled groaned under the impossible weight of the silver giant as Ellen hauled him across the threshold of her cabin. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world draped in oppressive, weeping fog. Every muscle in her back screamed and her palms were raw, but she didn't stop until the door was barred with a heavy iron bolt. Inside, the small space smelled of dried lavender and old parchment, and now the overpowering metallic scent of a dying king. "Just a little further," Ellen panted, sliding him onto a thick pallet of furs near the hearth. The twin pups, sensing the change in environment, tumbled out of their basket and waddled toward the massive wolf, burrowing into his neck with soft, needy whines. Ellen collapsed against the wall, her lungs burning. She looked at her hands, covered in his blood, a deep, vibrant crimson that seemed to pulse with a light of its own. She reached out to stroke the pup's head, but a sudden, violent crack echoed through the room. It sounded like ice breaking over a frozen lake. Ellen jumped back, her heart leaping into her throat. The silver wolf's body began to convulse, his massive frame lengthening and twisting in a grotesque agonizing dance of shifting bone. She watched in horrified awe as the fur retreated into skin the color of polished bronze, and the elongated muzzle softened into a sharp aristocratic jawline. Where the wolf had been, a man now lay. He was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly terrifying. Even unconscious and half-dead, he radiated an aura of absolute sovereignty. His hair was a chaotic silk of midnight black, and his chest, though mapped with scars and the jagged wound she had stitched, was broad and powerful. This was Maximus Decimus Vane, though Ellen didn't know his name yet. She only knew that no ordinary shifter possessed this kind of raw, crushing presence. "Oh gods," Ellen whispered, backing away. You're him." Before she could process the reality of a naked, wounded Alpha King in her kitchen, a heavy, rhythmic thudding shook the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. "Ellen, open the damn door." The voice belonged to Bane Talonsnyder, the lead enforcer of the Crescent Moon Pack. He was a cruel, narrow-minded brute who took personal pleasure in reminding Ellen of her wolfless status. Ellen froze. If Bane saw the man on her floor, she was dead. If he saw the pups, royal heirs, he would likely kill them to claim a reward from whoever had sent the king into hiding. "1 minute, Bane," she shouted, her voice trembling as she grabbed a heavy wool blanket and threw it over Maximus, tucking the pups deep into the shadows of the woodpile. She wiped her bloody hands on her apron and cracked the door just an inch. Bane stood there, his eyes scanning the cabin with predatory suspicion. Behind him stood 2 other enforcers, their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of the air. "There's a scent of blood coming from this shack, Omega," Bane sneered, shoving the door open with enough force to send Ellen stumbling. "And not just deer blood. Something fold. Something royal. I found a wounded elk in the brush," Ellen lied, her voice a thin wire about to snap. "I harvested what I could. I'm an Omega, Bane. I have to eat too." Bane walked toward the hearth, his boots clicking on the floorboards. He stopped inches from where Maximus lay hidden under the furs. Ellen's breath hitched. She saw a drop of fresh blood leak from beneath the blanket, staining the wood. "You're a liar, Ellen," Bane whispered, leaning down. He reached for the edge of the blanket. "And liars in this pack get their tongues cut out." Just as his fingers grazed the wool, a low, predatory growl, not from a wolf but from a man's throat, vibrated through the room. The air in the cabin suddenly felt 3 times heavier, as if the gravity itself had increased. Bane jerked back, his face turning ashen. "What was that?" "The wind," Ellen gasped, throwing herself between Bane and the hearth. "It's just the wind in the chimney. Please, Bane, take some of the dried meat and go. I don't want any trouble." Bane looked at her, his eyes narrowing. He sensed something was wrong, but the sheer impossibility of the Alpha King being in a defects cabin made him hesitate. He reached out and gripped Ellen's jaw, squeezing until tears pricked her eyes. "I'll be back, little bird," he hissed. "And if I find out you're hiding something from the council, I'll make sure you're the first one thrown to the rogues when the moon turns red." He spat on her floor and signaled his men to leave. As the door slammed shut, Ellen collapsed to her knees, her entire body shaking. She crawled over to the pallet and pulled back the blanket. Maximus was awake. His eyes were no longer gold. They were a piercing, icy blue, and they were fixed on Ellen with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He reached out, his hand, large, scarred and warm, wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't aggressive, it was anchoring. "Why did you hide me?" His voice was a gravelly rasp and used to human speech in this form. "Because they would have killed you," Ellen whispered. "You are wolfless," he noted, his gaze drifting to the brand on her shoulder that marked her as an Omega. "Why risk your life for a king who is nothing to you?" Ellen looked at the twin pups who were now crawling over his chest, sensing their father was conscious. "Because no one should have to face the dark alone," she said softly. "Not even a king." Maximus stared at her, a flicker of something, admiration perhaps or a confusion he couldn't name, crossing his face. He tried to sit up, but the wound on his side tore further and he let out a choked hiss of pain. "They are coming," Maximus warned, his voice dropping an octave. "My brother. He didn't just want my throne. He wants my children. He won't stop until this forest is ash." Ellen realized then that the inciting incident wasn't just finding the wolf. It was the moment she chose to side with him. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was a conspirator in a royal coup. Then we have to leave, Ellen said, her resolve hardening. I know a place. Higher in the mountains. The dead zone, where the pack links don't reach. If we can get you there, you can heal. Maximus looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, the wolfless girl with the heart of a lioness. What is your name, little healer? Ellen, she replied. Ellen, he repeated, the name sounding like a prayer in his deep voice. If we survive this, I will make sure the world never forgets it. The ascent into the Iron Spine Mountains was a grueling, silent trek through the dead zone. A stretch of jagged peaks and dense, silver-misted valleys where the magical resonance of the pack link flickered and died. For Ellen, it was the only place she had ever felt truly equal. Here everyone was deaf to the mental chatter of the wolves. But for Maximus Decimus Vane, it was a sensory deprivation chamber. He leaned heavily on Ellen, his massive arm draped over her shoulders. Every step was a battle against the ragged tear in his side. Despite the pain, he refused to let her carry the pups. They were tucked into a reinforced leather sling against his chest, their small heartbeats drumming against his own. You're shivering, Maximus rasped, his voice vibrating against Ellen's ear. The mountain air was thinning, turning into a biting, crystalline frost that settled in her hair. I'm fine, Ellen lied, her teeth chattering. We're almost at the Highwatch Cave. My grandfather used it for trapping before the Great Winter. It's hidden by a waterfall that never freezes. Maximus stopped, forcing her to halt with him. He turned her toward him, his icy blue eyes searching her face. You are a terrible liar, Ellen Ripleyborn. Your skin is like marble and your pulse is racing. Before she could protest, he pulled her closer, wrapping his free arm around her waist. The heat radiating from him was staggering, the furnace-like temperature of an alpha king. For a moment the world stopped. The smell of him, cedar, ozone, and a hint of wild honey, overwhelmed her senses. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was a magnetic pull, a gravity she didn't know how to resist. Better? He murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of the distant falls. Better. They continued, the tension between them shifting from the fear of pursuit to a growing, localized electricity. Every time their hands brushed or his weight shifted against her, a jolt of awareness snapped through Ellen. She was a defect, an omega who should have been repelled by such a dominant presence, yet she found herself leaning into him, seeking the sanctuary of his strength. But the mountain was not empty. As they neared the waterfall, a low, guttural howl echoed through the canyon. It wasn't the call of a crescent moon wolf. It was something darker, a rogue's cry. They've tracked the scent of the pups, Maximus hissed, his posture shifting instantly from wounded man to lethal protector. He shoved Ellen behind him even as his knees buckled from the effort. The healing process is too slow. The scent is a beacon. Wait, Ellen said, reaching into her pack. She pulled out a bundle of pungent, black-stained roots. Ghost root. It masks everything. It smells like rotten old earth. If I crush this and we smear it on the entrance, they'll pass us by. It won't be enough if they see us, Maximus countered, his hand going to the hilt of a hunting knife Ellen had given him. Suddenly, a massive, scarred rogue wolf lunged from the overhanging ledge. It was a beast of nightmare, mangy, crazed, and driven by the scent of royal blood. Maximus roared, a sound that shook the very frost from the trees and met the wolf mid-air. The struggle was a blur of silver and gray. Maximus was still too weak to shift, fighting in his human form with the ferocity of a god. Ellen didn't just watch. She grabbed a heavy, jagged stone and, with a scream of primal defiance, slammed it into the rogue's skull as it pinned Maximus to the snow. The rogue slumped, dead. Maximus lay panting in the crimson-stained slush, looking up at Ellen with a mixture of shock and profound respect. He saw the fire in her eyes, the fire of a woman who didn't need a wolf to be a warrior. You saved me again, he breathed, reaching up to wipe a smudge of blood from her cheek. Why do you keep doing it, Ellen? You could have run. You could have left us to the wolves. Ellen knelt beside him, her heart thudding. Because you're the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see a defect. You see me, Maximus. And I see you. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her down until their foreheads rested against each other. The air was thick with the scent of ghost root and death, but in the center of that storm, there was a budding, fragile hope. When I take back my throne, Maximus whispered, his voice a vow, the laws of the wolfless will change. I swear it on the lives of my sons. But as they reached the cave and the waterfall's roar masked their voices, a new shadow appeared on the horizon. Not a rogue but a fleet of black-cloaked riders, the elite guard of the usurper Maximus's own brother. They weren't just hunting a wolf, they were hunting a legend. The High Watch Cave was a cathedral of stone and ice, hidden behind the thunderous, shimmering curtain of the waterfall. Inside, the air was surprisingly dry, smelling of ancient flint and the ghost of fires long extinguished. Ellen had quickly set to work, lighting a small, smokeless fire and laying out a bed of thick cedar boughs for Maximus and the pups. Maximus sat against the cave wall, the twins, Luke Skywalker Grimes and Leia Organa Grimes, tumbling over his outstretched legs. In the flickering firelight, he looked less like a fallen king and more like a man burdened by the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. He watched Ellen move with a grace that wasn't taught in the high courts, but forged in the wild. "Ellen," he called softly, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "Come here. Rest. You have given enough of your blood and sweat for one night." Ellen sat beside him, the heat of his body acting as a magnetic north for her shivering frame. For a long moment, there was only the roar of the water and the crackle of the flames. Then Maximus reached into a hidden pocket of his tattered trousers and pulled out a heavy obsidian signet ring, the seal of the Alpha King. "My brother Cassius didn't just ambush me for the crown," Maximus said, his eyes darkening to the color of a stormy sea. "He had help. Internal help. He knew exactly where I would be when I took the twins to the sacred grove for their first lunar blessing. He knew I wouldn't shift in front of them while they were so young, fearing the raw power of the transformation might harm their developing senses." Ellen frowned, her mind racing. "But who would betray a king like you? Your counsel is handpicked." Maximus looked at her, a strange, piercing light in his eyes. "The betrayal goes deeper than politics, Ellen. It goes back to the Great Purge 25 years ago, the night the wolfless were rounded up and cast out of the central cities. My father ordered it, believing that a pack was only as strong as its weakest link." Ellen flinched. That was the night her parents had died, leaving her a toddler in the dirt of the Crescent Moon Pack's slums. "I was a boy then," Maximus continued, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "I watched a woman, a healer of the royal court, flee into these very mountains with a child. She was wolfless, but she carried a secret that could have united our kinds. She was the true mate of the High Alpha, my father's own brother." Ellen's breath hitched. "What does that have to do with me?" Maximus reached out, his thumb tracing the jagged star-shaped birthmark on the side of her neck, a mark she had always been told was a deformity. "This isn't a scar, Ellen. It's the mark of the celestial. You aren't wolfless, because you are a defect. You are wolfless because your power is dormant, suppressed by the very bloodline that cast you out. You are the daughter of the lost prince. My cousin. And by the laws of the old blood, your claim to the throne is as valid as mine." The world tilted. Ellen pulled her hand away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No, that's impossible. I'm an Omega. I'm a servant. I scrub floors and pull weeds." "You saved an Alpha King with nothing but a stone and a prayer," Maximus countered, his voice rising with a sudden fierce passion. "You healed a wound that should have been fatal. Do you think a common human could handle the caustic energy of a king's blood without burning?" Before Ellen could respond, the shadows at the mouth of the cave shifted. The waterfall didn't just roar, it screamed. A tall, slender figure stepped through the veil of water, completely dry, eyes glowing with a malevolent crimson light. It was Cassius, the usurper. "A touching family reunion," Cassius sneered, his voice like grinding glass. He didn't look at Maximus. His gaze was locked on Ellen. "I spent years looking for the star-marked brat. To think my brother found her while bleeding out in the mud. How poetic." Maximus surged to his feet, a low tectonic growl ripping from his throat, but Cassius raised a hand, and a wave of dark, shimmering energy slammed Maximus back against the stone wall. The twins let out terrified shrieks, scurrying behind Ellen. "Don't touch them!" Ellen screamed, stepping in front of the pups, her arms spread wide. Cassius laughed, a cold, hollow sound. And what will you do, little defect? You have no wolf. You have no pack. You are a ghost standing in the way of a god. He lunged forward, his hand snapping toward Ellen's throat. In that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, something inside Ellen snapped. A heat hotter than any forge erupted from the base of her spine. The star on her neck began to glow with a blinding white gold light that illuminated the entire cavern. A shockwave of pure lunar energy exploded from her body, throwing Cassius through the waterfall and into the rocky abyss below. The cave fell silent, the only sound the frantic gasps of Ellen as she collapsed to her knees, her skin shimmering with a faint iridescent dust. Maximus crawled to her, his face pale with awe. He didn't see an Omega anymore. He saw the missing piece of a broken world. But as he reached for her, a horn sounded in the distance, the great hunt. Cassius wasn't alone. An army was descending on the mountain, and they now knew exactly where the star-marked queen was hiding. The golden light fading from Ellen's skin left behind a cold, hollow ache that felt like she had been hollowed out by a glacier. The cavern, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Outside, the rhythmic, thunderous beating of war drums drowned out the waterfall, and the scent of silver-tipped arrows and wolfsbane smoke began to seep through the mist. "They're here," Maximus Decimus Vane rasped, his voice tight with a desperation Ellen had never heard before. He lunged for her, his large hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Ellen, listen to me. Cassius didn't come alone. He has the Ironclaw Legion. They don't just kill, they erase. They will tear this mountain apart to find you and the twins." "I won't leave you," Ellen cried, her voice breaking as she grabbed his wrists. "I just found out who I am. I just found this." She gestured to the glowing embers of the fire, her heart shattering at the thought of losing the only man who had ever truly seen her. "You have to," Maximus commanded, his blue eyes burning with a sacrificial fire. He scooped up the twins, Luke and Leia, and pressed them into Ellen's arms. The pups were trembling, their small hearts hammering against Ellen's chest like frantic hummingbirds. "There is a narrow chimney at the back of this cave. It leads to the high pass. It's too small for a shifted wolf, and I am still too wounded to make the climb quickly enough. You take them. You run for the neutral territories of the Sunspear pack." "Maximus, no. Go," he roared, the sound vibrating in the very stone beneath their feet. He turned toward the mouth of the cave, his body beginning to shift, a forced, agonizing transformation that drew a guttural scream of pain from his throat. His bones snapped and reset, his skin erupted into silver fur, but his movements were sluggish, hampered by the jagged wound on his flank that began to weep fresh blood. Ellen felt a hand of ice wrap around her heart. She looked at the chimney, then back at the man, the king, who was preparing to hold off an army with nothing but his teeth and his dying strength. "I love you," she whispered, the words catching in the roar of the wind. Maximus, now a massive, battle-scarred wolf, paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't look back, he couldn't, but a low, mournful whine escaped him, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Then, with a savage growl, he lunged through the waterfall, disappearing into the curtain of white water to face his brother's legion. Ellen scrambled into the chimney, the rough stone tearing at her palms and knees. Every inch upward was a battle against gravity and despair. Below her, the sounds of carnage erupted. She heard the clash of steel, the horrific snarls of shifting wolves, and the unmistakable, agonized howl of a king being brought to his knees. "Don't look back," she sobbed to the pups, tucking them tighter into her tunic. "Don't look back." When she finally reached the summit, the world was a blur of white and gray. A blizzard had rolled in, a whiteout that blinded everything. Ellen stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged, frozen gasps. She was alone. Truly alone. The man she loved was likely being dragged in chains back to a throne of thorns, and she was a wolfless queen with 2 royal orphans in a frozen wasteland. She collapsed beneath the skeletal branches of a dead pine, her strength finally failing. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing the life out of her. She looked at the twins, their fur frosted with ice, their whimpers fading into silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as the darkness began to claim her. "I'm so sorry." As her consciousness drifted, she felt a sudden, sharp sting on her neck, the star mark. It pulsed once, a dull, warning throb. Through the veil of the blizzard, a silhouette appeared. It wasn't a wolf. It was a man in black armor, his face obscured by a silver visor. He knelt beside her, his gauntlet cold against her cheek. "Found you," he murmured, his voice devoid of mercy. Everything went black. The separation was complete. The king was captured, the queen was lost, and the twins were in the hands of the very shadow they had spent their lives fleeing. Hope wasn't just fading, it was extinguished. The darkness wasn't the end, it was a cocoon. When Ellen's eyes finally fluttered open, she wasn't in the snow and she wasn't in a dungeon. She was lying on a bed of soft, sun-warmed moss inside a hidden grotto, the air thick with the scent of crushed eucalyptus and ancient magic. Standing over her was not a soldier of the Ironclaw Legion, but a woman with silver hair that reached her ankles and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 moons. It was Galadriel Theron Loomis, the exiled seer of the north. "You're awake, child of the stars," Galadriel whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The twins." Ellen rasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Where are they?" "Safe." Galadriel gestured to a corner where Luke and Leia were curled up on a pile of furs, sleeping soundly. "The man in black who found you was no enemy. He is a ghost walker, one of the few who still remains loyal to the true bloodline. He brought you here because the mountain itself cried out when your mark ignited." Ellen sat up, her body aching but her mind clearer than it had ever been. "Maximus. They took him. Cassius took him. I felt it, a hollow space in my soul where his presence used to be." Galadriel knelt beside her, placing a cool hand on Ellen's star mark. "The bond between a Celestial and an Alpha King is not so easily severed, Ellen. He is alive, but he is being held in the Iron Spire fortress. Cassius intends to execute him at the solar eclipse, 3 days from now, to finalize the transfer of power." "I have to go to him," Ellen said, her voice hardening with a resolve that surprised even her. "I have no army. I have no wolf. But I have, whatever this is." She looked at her palms, which still held a faint, lingering shimmer of gold. "You have more than that," Galadriel countered. "You have the blood of the High Alphas. You are not wolfless, Ellen. Your wolf was never absent. She was waiting for a heart strong enough to carry her power. The trauma of your childhood, the fear of the Great Purge, it locked her away to keep you safe. But now the king's sacrifice has broken the seal." Galadriel handed Ellen a bowl of silver liquid, lunar nectar. "Drink. If you want to save your king, you must stop being the victim of your story and start being the author." Ellen drank. The liquid was like swallowing a star. It burned through her veins, incinerating every doubt, every fear and every defect she had ever been labeled with. Deep inside her, a dormant engine roared to life. For the first time she felt a second heartbeat, one that was wild, ancient and utterly feral. "He saved me when I was nothing," Ellen whispered, the gold in her skin flaring with blinding intensity. "Now I'm going to tear his prison down stone by stone." Outside the grotto, a dozen Ghostwalker warriors emerged from the mist, kneeling as one before the woman who stood at the entrance. She wasn't the quiet Omega from the forest anymore. She was the Celestial Queen, and her eyes, once soft and brown, were now swirling pools of molten white gold. "The eclipse is coming," Ellen told the warriors, her voice carrying the weight of a command. "And so are we." She looked at the twins one last time, promising them a world where they would never have to hide. The turning point was reached. The prey was now the hunter, and for the first time in 25 years, the wolfless were about to howl. The Iron Spire fortress was a jagged monolith of black obsidian that seemed to pierce the very heart of the sky. As the moon began its slow, terminal crawl across the face of the sun, the world fell into a sickly, bruised twilight. The solar eclipse, the moment of the king's execution, had arrived. On the ramparts, Cassius stood over a kneeling, broken Maximus Decimus Vane. Maximus was back in his human form, stripped of his dignity and bound in silver-lined chains that burned his skin with every breath. His eyes were dull, the icy blue clouded by the poison of wolfsbane coursing through his veins. "Look at the horizon, brother," Cassius mocked, pressing a cold steel blade against Maximus's throat. "The era of the noble king ends in shadow. I will rule a pack of predators, not a nursery of weaklings." But the shadow didn't come from the sun. It came from the forest. A roar so loud it cracked the obsidian walls of the fortress shook the ground. Out of the mist emerged a creature of legend. A wolf the size of a carriage, her fur not silver or gray, but a blinding, iridescent white that shimmered like a fallen star. It was Ellen Ripley-born, fully shifted, her dormant power finally unleashed. Behind her surged the ghost walkers and the oppressed omegas of a dozen packs, a tidal wave of the worthless reclaiming their world. "The star-marked queen," a soldier cried, but his voice was cut short as Ellen leaped. She didn't just run, she blurred. She was a streak of celestial lightning. She cleared the 50-foot outer wall in a single gravity-defying bound, her massive paws shattering the stone battlements. With a snarl that sounded like a choir of angels and demons, she tore through the Ironclaw Legion. Arrows bounced off her hide like rain, spears shattered against her chest. Cassius panicked. "Kill him. Kill the king now." As Cassius swung his blade, Ellen shifted mid-air, a feat of control unheard of in shifter history. She landed on the platform in her human form, her skin glowing with such intensity that the soldiers were blinded. She caught the blade with her bare hand, the steel melting into liquid slag against her palm. "You," Ellen said, her voice echoing with the power of the high alphas, "are finished." She didn't use a weapon. She reached out and touched Cassius's chest, right over his blackened heart. The white-gold energy of the celestial mark flooded into him, not as a gift but as a judgment. The dark magic he had used to steal the throne was incinerated instantly. Cassius let out a hollow scream as his wolf was stripped away, leaving him a shivering, powerless human. Ellen turned to Maximus. With a snap of her fingers, the silver chains turned to dust. "Ellen." Maximus gasped, his voice cracking as the wolfsbane toxin was purged by her proximity. He looked up at her, not just the woman who had saved him in the woods, but his equal, his queen. "I told you," Ellen whispered, pulling him into her arms even as the army below breached the gates. "You are not dying in the dirt today." Maximus stood, his strength returning in a violent golden surge. He shifted beside her, the great silver king and the celestial white queen standing side by side on the highest peak of the world. As the sun emerged from behind the moon, bathing them in pure, renewed light, the surviving soldiers dropped to their knees. The mystery was solved. The defect was the savior. The twist was complete. The wolfless girl was the source of the wolf's power. The battle was won not through cruelty, but through the very compassion that had led an Omega to save a wounded stranger in a storm. The echoes of battle were replaced by the harmonious hum of a kingdom reborn. 3 months had passed since the obsidian walls of the Iron Spire were breached, and the frost of the mountains had given way to a lush, vibrant spring. The High Court was no longer a place of cold steel and fear, but a sanctuary of light and blooming jasmine. Ellen Ripley-born stood on the royal balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. She wore a gown of shimmering silk, but her feet were bare, keeping her connected to the earth she had spent her life tending. Beside her, the twins, Luke and Leia, tumbled across the stone floor, their small shifts becoming more controlled each day, their yips of joy filling the air. "They have your spirit," a deep, resonant voice rumbled behind her. Ellen turned as Maximus Decimus Vane stepped into the light. He looked every bit the Alpha King, but the hard edges of his face had softened. He reached out, his large hand settling comfortably on the small of her back. The bond between them was no longer a frantic lifeline in the dark. It was a steady, pulsing rhythm of mutual respect and profound love. "And they have your appetite," Ellen joked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They've already gone through 2 baskets of mountain berries today." Maximus laughed, a sound that carried across the courtyard where wolves of all ranks, Alpha, Beta, and the newly honored Omegas, mingled without fear. The Great Purge laws had been struck from the records, replaced by the Edict of the Celestial, ensuring that every member of the pack, shifted or not, was valued for their soul rather than their strength. "You've changed everything, Ellen," Maximus whispered, turning her to face him. He reached into the folds of his tunic and pulled out a necklace. A single uncut diamond from the High Watch cave, suspended on a chain of braided silver. "The pack is whole. My sons are safe. And I am no longer a king sitting on a lonely throne." He knelt before her, not as a monarch to a subject but as a man to his mate. "Will you rule beside me?" Not just as my queen but as the heart of this world? I spent my life guarding a kingdom, but I want to spend the rest of it guarding you. Tears of fulfillment pricked Ellen's eyes. She thought back to the quiet, lonely girl who had hidden in the cedar trees, the defect, who thought she had no place in the world. She realized now that her lack of a wolf had never been a curse. It was the space left open for a destiny she never could have imagined. Yes, she breathed, pulling him up to meet her. Always. As they kissed, a soft white gold light radiated from Ellen's skin, answered by the steady silver glow of Maximus's aura. Below, the pack erupted into a chorus of celebratory howls, a symphony of unity that reached the furthest corners of the forest. The mystery of the wounded wolf was solved, the war for the throne was over, and the woman the world had cast aside had finally found her way home. The future was no longer a dark forest to be feared, but a wide, sunlit horizon waiting to be explored. Together, the king and his celestial queen watched as the first stars of the evening appeared, a permanent reminder that even in the deepest night, there is a light that can never be extinguished.